Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and welcome to the post 71. Should I transfer my PhD enrolment? Now, this post and the next one comes via request from Queen G. I'll anonymise it just in case. And I have split this request about how you transfer a PhD between institutions, but I've split it into two parts. This first part does the interior work. I get you thinking about the nature of yourself as a researcher, the nature of your research, and your emotional and personal reasons to transfer. Next week, we look at the much more professional requirements, the documents you are going to require to present to another university to enable that transfer. But before we can get there, we have to do the interior work, and that's our goal for the week. So let's do that. Now, I've mentioned and will mention the word risk a lot in this session today, but particularly in the session next week, because we need to recognise that every single time that a university enrolls a student in a PhD, that is a risk. Every enrolment is a risk. It's 3 years and we do not know what is going to happen, and attrition rates are high. So universities take a risk every time a student is enrolled. But let's not talk about the institutional risk at the moment. Let's talk about you and risk. Let's see if this transfer is viable for you by doing some interior work. Transferring a PhD between institutions is really, really difficult. It's tough. Now, this used to be a really minor issue, and I tell you why. In the old days, even 10 years ago, there were a lot of academics who stayed at one institution for decades. So often they would even finish their PhD there, and then they would continue to work in this organisation. So they would be in a university for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, their entire career. Now, that longevity as an academic in one institution presents a series of problems for the institution. I would also argue it presents a series of challenges for knowledge, but that's a whole other issue. For PhD students, however, that longevity of a workforce was an absolute gift, was wonderful. But now the university sector has radically changed. It's not even recognisable from what was a university 20 years ago. What we've got is endless restructures where academics are simply sacked, and they simply clean out their office, they take a box to their car, and they're gone from the institution. Doesn't matter how many PhD students they've got. If they're restructured out of the organisation, you no longer have a supervisor. We also have this odd new contract that exists in universities that are called something like teaching only contracts. So what would be a balanced academic, teaching and research, they can supervise PhD students. Those colleagues are suddenly put on a teaching only contract and they're not allowed to supervise. But we've also got some very serious things happening in institutions at the moment where academics are simply doing a dummy spit and going, this is just rubbish, and they're leaving the institution and leaving it quickly. And then, of course, we've got the quiet quitting cultures where academics have got all sorts of mental health concerns, sicknesses, and, of course, death, including death by suicide. So a lot of really catastrophic things are happening in our universities every single day, and they impact on you as a PhD student in very odd and unexpected ways. So this is a very volatile time to be doing a PhD. It's a very volatile time to try and find stable supervisors, let alone stable supervision. We also, during this time of catastrophe and volatility and so forth, at the same period, we've never had more regulation and governance over what is a PhD and what behaviours are appropriate. So that's a very interesting parallel movement. So as we've talked about really throughout all these video series, the PhD has many definitions, but one definition is that it is a time-based degree. And that means a PhD, by its very nature, is defined via the length of a candidature. So if you go beyond that nationally designated length, then you're simply removed from the organisation. Now, for example, and this is really interesting, I'm watching this at the moment, there are 2 institutions in Australia today who disenroll a student one day after the 4-year clicks. So in Australia, a PhD by definition is an enrolment between 3 years full-time and 4 years as a maximum, right? So there are 2 institutions in Australia. The moment a student is enrolled 4 years and 1 day, they are removed from enrolment. They're gone. So their candidature is over. So what I want to talk about today, noting this very complicated context around the doctorate, is what you need to think about. This is all about you, what you need to think about before you even consider transferring your candidature. The PhD is about you. Now, I know it's a cliche, it's your PhD, it's your PhD, it's your PhD. But that cliche exists for a reason, because it is your PhD. So before you are approaching another institution to transfer, to take over that doctorate, we've got some questions that we've got to ask you. And you have to answer those questions honestly. The key question, just to start our story today, is, would you supervise you? Would you supervise you? Now, no platitudes, no excuses, none of this. Would you supervise you? This is a crucial question to answer with honesty. And particularly if you are considering transferring, you need to know that in the instability of international higher education, you're going to be asked some very difficult questions. Through this transfer, some very powerful people are going to ask you some very difficult questions. So you have to formulate answers to these questions. So the literature I've consulted for this post involves a series of different national legislations around the world, but also institutional regulations. And I found a fascinating literature, which, to be honest with you, I never really thought about it as a genre in the scholarship of supervision, but it is about students at the point of attrition and whether they should continue or retreat, whether they should transfer or retreat. So you'll see that in the reference list. Some very interesting research is there, so I recommend that to you. And look, I do note that even in the regulations, you see, and the legislations, you see that transfer of enrolments, they're very rarely mentioned. But to be honest with you, today, right now, every single student that enrolls in a PhD must be prepared to transfer. Too often, transfers are framed around crisis. So something catastrophic happens and you have to very, very quickly enact movement. Now, I'm trying to avoid that today. If you are enrolled in a doctorate, to be frank with you, if you are employed at a university, some of the questions that we're going to ask today, it's very good to be prescient and think through these matters, not at a time of crisis, but dispassionately. So while holding on to that question, would you supervise you, let's prepare you personally and emotionally to enact a transfer. And just a warning, as you might have picked up, I'm really not pulling any punches this week. And I'll tell you why. This is someone who's been, a dean at different organisations for a lot of a decade. Transfers are very difficult. Very difficult. And when you decide to transfer, you're asking that other humans, deans, supervisors, spend hundreds of hours to enable that transfer. You're about to ask people that you don't know to give hundreds of hours of their own time away from their families, away from their research, to enable your transfer. So before you ask another human being to do that work for you, let's explore these 5 mantras to get you mentally and emotionally organised. 1. Am I able to complete where I am? Don't transfer if you absolutely don't have to transfer. Transfers are difficult and you require another set of supervisors, and bits of legislation are involved to organise and regulate that movement between institutions. You see, what happens when you transfer is 2 deans of graduate studies or graduate research have to meet and exchange a series of emails. They have to do a count on the number of days you've had in an enrolment and what's left from your enrolment to transfer to another organisation. This is a formal movement. This is a regulated movement. So if you're embarrassed, if you're squeamish, talking about yourself and your research and what went right and what went wrong, then don't transfer, because you are going to have to justify this transfer to senior people in a university, and they will ask the difficult questions because they have to. So if there is any chance you can finish at one institution, then please do it. And you'll see this is a recurrent theme of my 5 mantras, my 5 questions of you this week. Really ask yourself why you are transferring. Are you running away from something? Very tough question, very important question. Are you running away from something? That's okay, we all run away from things, but speak the words. What are you running away from? Now, are you stopping yourself confronting a very serious question about you, your motivation, your connection with the research? Are you blocking addressing a very significant issue and you think the transfer is an easy option? So if there's any chance in staying in one institution and finishing, you really need to do that. Things will get very difficult and very sticky very quickly. So if you can finish, you need to finish, and quickly, in one institution. 2, get your data sets collected as quickly as possible. You've heard me say this to so many students over the years. Let me now tell you why I say this. It is so much easier to transfer if you have completed your data collection. Full stop. It is unbelievably difficult to transfer if you haven't done your data collection or you're halfway through your data collection. And this is particularly sticky in the experimental sciences and the applied social sciences. And if you're in those areas, and of course that's a big chunk of the university, experimental sciences, applied social sciences, if you haven't done your data collection, you have to expect your new supervisor in your new university, the new dean in the new university, to say to you, you know what, you need to start a new project. So whatever you were working on, that's gone. You haven't done the data collection, wasn't a project anyway, you now need to start again. So all that time, all that work has gone. So if your data collection is complete and you're in the old-fashioned writing up phase, then a transfer is relatively straightforward. Now, if not, then you really have to be prepared for a new university to say to you, you know what, if you're transferring, you're going to have to change projects. And then, of course, your clock commences again. So in many ways at that point, you're not a transfer student, you are a new student. The clock starts again because it is a new project. So this matter of data collection, as you can see, is absolutely crucial, but particularly with regard to, and yes, we are going there, intellectual property. Now, in Australia, and this does differ quite radically internationally, so check your own regs, okay? But higher education students in Australia own their own IP, intellectual property, unless they sign it away. Now, if a student has signed away their IP, and that often happens very, very early in the enrolment, then to be frank with you, you don't have any actual project to transfer. So I've had to do negotiations as a student moves between supervisors in one institution, and the IP gets incredibly messed up. So to give you one example of a student was staying in one institution and just wanted to move supervisors, probably quite rightly, can I say, but the supervisor that was being left or dumped proceeded to state, right, well, this is my IP, so this is my project, then poisoned the relationship with the industry partner, so the student wasn't even allowed to go into the organisation to set foot into the building, and with 6 months left on the clock, the student had no project left. So the IP was simply removed from them, the industry partnership removed from them, they had nothing left. So even at the point of enrolment, so for a lot of people that are thinking about getting into a doctorate, you write to me all the time, it's wonderful. What I want you to do is be very aware right at the start of the consequences of signing away your intellectual property. And if you ever in the future have to consider a transfer, then an IP agreement renders that transfer incredibly difficult. Therefore, if your data collection is complete and you own your intellectual property, then a transfer is relatively straightforward. Okay, 3. Oh no! Sort out the authorship of articles. Now, I would really like to apologise that we're having to have this conversation. I apologise. But a large number of supervisors, a large number of prospective supervisors are only interested in you and only interested in the supervision because of the publications they can get off you. Full stop. So they are supervising for one reason, and that is to get the authorship of articles. I'm sorry about that. It shouldn't be this way. It is. And look, I understand, and look, I want to be sympathetic. I understand in some disciplines it has to be this way. Remember, I'm married to an experimental physicist, a surface scientist. I understand the complexity of these projects, okay? So I get that. When you've got the big projects, you need a team. I understand that. Different disciplines, preaching to the choir, you got it. But you see, the authorship practices in some disciplines, and in fact, all disciplines, if you're being supervised by a truly ruthless, dreadful human being, means that it becomes incredibly difficult to transfer. And authorship matters can block any transfer. So, therefore, right at the start of your candidature, get the authorship matters really clear. Everything you write must be configured within the parameters of authorship agreements. Most nation states have research codes of conduct. Read them, understand them. Get the authorship relationship with your supervisor in writing via email. You need to get it with clarity in writing. Now, a major issue when a student transfers that blocks it is authorship variables with the supervisor. So let's say you're in the experimental sciences. Let's go there where collaborative co-authorship is relatively the norm. And let's run the case from the supervisor's perspective, okay? The supervisor has paid for all the chemicals. The supervisor has paid for the upkeep of the equipment, and many pieces of equipment, it's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars for maintenance alone. You may be working on $1 million, pound, euro piece of equipment to do your PhD. And remember, your supervisor had got a grant. So you are funded on a grant that your supervisor got, okay? And they did the research design and they've sliced off a bit of that, and that is your PhD, okay? So you've based your PhD on a bit of their research design, and they've paid for your materials, okay? Now, at that point, when all the experiments are completed, you decide to transfer. And that's where supervisors get very, very angry. Very angry. Now, I need to clarify, by the Australian Code of the Responsible Conduct of Research, most research codes around the world, money does not connote authorship. This is important. Funding, grants, great. They have nothing to do with authorship. Okay, so they might say, I've paid for all of this. Yeah, you might have. That's still not authorship, okay? Now, an author in the Australian system and most of the systems post the Vancouver Protocol around the world, authorship is defined as contributing to 2 of 3 variables. And those 3 variables are research design, data collection and analysis, substantive writing and editing. They're the 3. Authorship is connoted when you contribute to 2 of those 3. Right. Now, I've had to do some very tough and nasty negotiations on students' behalf and with supervisors in my life, taken decades off my life. Some of the most grotesque, obviously, are involving sexual harassment and sexual assault. But can I say decades of my life, through stress, have been removed by doing these authorship negotiations when a student is transferring, okay? And they're horrible. Shouting, nastiness, oh, it's horrific. It's horrific. And how we often create a resolution, this is just a tip for punters if people want to know how you clear the decks a little bit, is you invariably involve a discussion between the student and the original supervisor. And there's an agreement, say, that 3 articles will have co-authorship. And so all of that existed in the past, thanks for playing, you've all got authorship, that's great. Then the next challenge is to state, we draw a line under that authorship. So those 3 articles, yes, absolutely great, previous supervisor. Now we draw a line, and the new supervisory team have co-authorship for the new arm of the project, often with the original supervisor placed in the acknowledgements for their early preliminary research design, but not the other 2 variables. You with me? So all of this has to exist in writing. Everybody has to agree to it. Everybody has to have a shout and a walkout. Whatever they're going to do, they need to do that. All of this needs to be in writing before a transfer takes place. And can I say, colleagues, this is why I've said for 20 years, students need to interview their prospective supervisors and talk about authorship. And I can think of 5 occasions at least in my life in the humanities and the theoretical social sciences where a student has come to the enrolment with a completely original project. No one else has been involved. They've come to the university with a project, and a prospective supervisor has stated, oh no, don't write a traditional thesis to get a book out of it, write a series of articles that I co-author. And when I as Dean get involved in some of these conversations and state, just to clarify, they're writing a traditional thesis, they're not writing a PhD by publication, and the supervisors, and they've been men and women, I was just about to say she, but they have been men and women. Don't know about non-binary, we'll check what that research says. But they said, oh, well, look, if I'm supervising, I need to have co-authorship. And I state actually supervision is different from authorship. And so, oh, well, look, I won't contribute to the project. I won't supervise it if I'm not getting authorship. So get these conversations out really early so that you can make a decision about what you're prepared to deal with and you understand the research code of conduct. Now, can I say this confusion between supervision and authorship is against the code, is against authorship in most systems around the world. But be aware, when we're doing a transfer, the complexity of the negotiation between supervision and authorship is often an absolute deal breaker. It's catastrophic. So deans are involved. It's so serious and it's so messy. The deans of organisations are involved to create the leverage, to create the negotiation and frame the negotiation to ensure the student can leave. Again, if you can finish at an institution, please finish at the institution, because IP and authorship can block any transfer. And to be honest with you, once you say to a supervisor, look, I'm out, this is not working for me, supervisors can behave aggressively and nastily and horrifically, and it can actually end your candidature, okay? So always remember, there are a group of people at our universities who accept all students that come to them because they want the publications. They're not hugely interested in completing the student and the completions. They don't need them, but they do need the publications to build their own career. And then of course they discard you when the institutions increasingly are saying, oh right, well there's a time limit here, your student hasn't finished. Remember, we've got universities, 4 years, 1 day, you're disenrolled. So what's happening is that a supervisor is using a student as a paper mill, working them to death, and then the completion is no interest to them. They just simply wanted the papers. And can I say, at 4 years and 1 day, it is very, very difficult to transfer a student. So recognise that completing a PhD is not a priority for a large group of academics in our culture right now. They are interested in co-authorship of articles, full stop. Now, all of this discussion that we've had, and it's been a tough discussion, but it makes a transfer incredibly difficult. So this means a Dean of Graduate Studies, a Dean of Graduate Research needs to intervene and work through at a granular level publications, authorship, IP, what is the research project that can be transferred. And so after these gritty administrative matters, let's now finish this off with my final 2 maxims that are completely about you. And I'd like us all to do the interior work this week and think about this before we do the professional documents in our gig next week. So 4, who do you blame for the failures in your candidature? This question is a proxy for your future institution. And when I've managed transfers, this is always the first question I ask a student. Why are you leaving your university? What went wrong? And you have to have answers to that question. So if you, when you're answering that question, you construct a blame list. So you blame your supervisors, you blame COVID, you blame delays in an ethics clearance, you blame a lack of equipment maintenance, you blame, as a student once said, blame a complete lack of conference funding. Her supervisor stopped her from going to an $8,000 registration conference, and that's what destroyed her candidature. Wish I was joking. So if this is the sort of list you're constructing, then you're listing what's gone wrong in the candidature, and none of that has involved you. Now, this is a red flag for any dean and any subsequent university. Can I say also any subsequent supervisor? The students who are respected through the transfer are the ones that have a really strong sense of what went wrong, what they did wrong, and how they are managing the changes to make it right. Now, I am working with a lot of students at the moment, often who have been discarded from these universities at 4 years and 1 day. And so I've been working with these students, and they're coming to me to try and write an appeal letter. And the letters are 5 pages or 10 pages in length. And in this letter, it's not really, an appeal, it's really a complaint letter while they're explaining what everybody else has done wrong. Right? Everybody else has done this to them. But the trouble is, if you're filled with blame and excuses, then that behaviour will follow you to every institution in which you will enrol. So therefore, all of us, need to do the tough work. You need to, cite one of our earlier posts, you need to do a mirror moment. You need to understand what you did wrong and how you are addressing what you did wrong. Now, I've just been working and trying to help students who have sent me a series of emails where they're trying to demonstrate why they should be allowed to continue an enrolment. And they've asked me particularly about the use of COVID in that letter. Right. Now, this is at the end of 2024 when these students are writing to me, okay? Let's just get real here for a moment. A student could have enrolled in a PhD at the height of COVID, March 2020, and already finished. So if you're arguing right at the end of 2024 that COVID had an impact on you, you just won't be believed, because people that were enrolled in 2020 have already finished and you haven't. So that excuse just isn't going to work. You will only be considered for a transfer if you've done the emotional, the personal, and the professional work. You have to understand what has gone wrong. You have to understand what you've contributed to that wrongness and how you are managing that, mitigating that, and improving that. And that is how you transfer. Now, 5. Here we go. Is your head in the game to finish? Is your head in the game to finish? Now, sorry to use the sporting metaphor and the cliche, but this is crucial. Before we progress to next week doing the concrete documents that you need to prepare to show professionalism through this transfer, we've got to have a tough conversation here. A PhD is a time-based degree. It is loss leading for the university. Let me explain what that means. It means that universities lose money through PhD candidatures. Okay? Remember, in Australia, we have a bit of legislation called the Research Training Program, the RTP, that was introduced through omnibus legislation near the end of 2016, starting from January 1, 2017. Universities, post the RTP, are only funded for their completion, not their load. Now, let me explain what that means. Get it out of policy speak and show you what it means. Every PhD student who is enrolled in Australia, universities receive no governmental funding at all for the enrolment. So universities are paying for the domestic students, we're paying your fees. Remember, domestic students in Australia don't pay fees. Who pays those fees? The universities pay those fees in what's called a fee offset, so the student doesn't have to pay. So the university's paying a fee offset, we're paying conferences or the library stuff, we're paying for your equipment, you're paying for your maintenance, electricity in your office. If you're getting a scholarship or stipend, we're paying that as well, okay? And the university receives nothing while all that money is going out. The universities are only paid when you complete. Okay, so in almost all cases, the money that the university receives for that completion does not cover what it cost to get you to completion. Okay, so if you are transferring your university, what you're hoping will be your new university, is only interested in the completion. So you've got to have a clear plan, you've got to be quick about finishing, and the completion is all that matters. So therefore, you really have to do some deep thinking. Are you transferring simply because it is an excuse not to leave the program. So really, should you be attriting? Do you just want to stop? And instead of making the really tough and courageous decision, right, I don't want to do a PhD anymore, I will withdraw. That's a very courageous decision, that's great. But we see a lot of transfer students that are not prepared to make that courageous decision, and instead they simply transfer, but of course they're merely transferring the problems. You with me? Because it's so much easier to float between institutions, blaming supervisors, blaming COVID, blaming equipment, rather than looking in the mirror and saying, you know what, I don't want to do a PhD. Okay, so at the point of transfer, you're going to be having a conversation with your new university about when you are going to finish. And they need to guarantee that you're going to finish, and you're going to finish quickly. So therefore, is your head in the game to finish quickly? Because remember, universities are heavily subsidising you to do this PhD. They are only paid when you finish. So therefore, do you want to finish? And indeed, have you got the concrete and guaranteed timeline to finish? I've always asked students, I need to see your timeline to completion. I don't even consider a transfer until I've seen the timeline to completion and concrete strategies to get there. So as you can see, enrolling in a PhD is risky. It's risky for the student, it's risky for the supervisor, it's risky for the institution. And a transfer student only intensifies the risk. So next week we're going to talk about the professional documents that you will need to present for assessment by your new university. But our homework this week is for all of us to think really deeply, do the deep, emotional, personal work, and start to assess our commitment, start to assess our motivation. And by the way, can I say, this is a great exercise for all higher degree students. I would argue it's a great exercise for all human beings doing research, because the difference between being stable in your enrolment and needing to transfer is one restructure of your organisation. So we are living in tough times, but yes, we can prepare for them. Let's do it. I wish you love, light and peace. Tea out.